Well, welcome everybody. I'm Michael Kerman with Leading Edge Seminars, and I'm so happy to welcome you to this very interesting, I think it'll be very interesting virtual lunch together with Janina Scarlet. It's always nice to see faces on a screen. If you feel comfortable in joining us that way, that's great. But if not, that's also just fine. Um, what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you a few things about what's coming up. Um, then I'll introduce Janina. I'll tell you about how we can connect online if you'd like to ask questions, other things about Zoom. And then we'll spend the hour with Janina. I think it's really going to be pretty special. I'll tell you more about in a minute. First, I do want to let you know about some things that are coming up that we're excited about. You may know that we're going to Cancun for the month of February, having 4 weeks of trainings, half-day trainings at a beautiful resort. Some of our speakers are Bessel van der Kolk, Janina Fisher, Frank Anderson. But on November 16th, we're having a meet and greet with Bessel van der Kolk and Leisha Sky, who's presenting with him in Cancun. And it's really a half-hour opportunity. If you're at all curious about coming to Cancun or seeing what Bessel van der Kolk is up to these days, he'll join us on November 16th. November 23rd, we're going to do the same thing with Diana Fosha, who will also be in Cancun. Anyway, we'll send you some information about that. Our next webinar is November 18th and 19th with Margaret Wernberg, who's presented a lot for us on anxiety and depression. And this time it's a 2-day program about working with people who have both anxiety and depression. The webinar after that is with Janina Scarlet, who you're going to meet today. It's on December 3rd and 4th. It's on her superhero therapy. And if you're here today or you watch this video later, we'll send a 15% off coupon if you want to join Janina again in a few weeks' time. Let me tell you about how we're going to work today. If you haven't been with us before, Emily Porter on our screen is officially our hostess with the mostest, which means she's there for Janina. She's there for you. If you have questions for Janina when it comes to question time, which will be in about a half hour or so, you can either go to the chat line, let Emily know you have a question. If you'd like her to read it, that's fine. Otherwise, you just say, I have a question. You can also use the raise hand function on the Zoom screen. And, we encourage you to think of questions you'd like to ask and connect directly with Janina. If you have any other problems with anything that Emily can help you with, go to the chat line. Everything we're doing now has live transcription. So if you'd like to see the words closed caption on your screen, just see the live transcription box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Finally, everything we do is recorded and sent to you. So you're going to get a message in your box with this video if you missed it or you're watching it the first time because you weren't able to be here live. Sometimes if things come up during our talks, resources, ideas, we also send those out. So you'll have them. So you don't have to take notes. If you hear about something interesting, will probably be in that message. So for those of you who've been with me before these virtual lunches, most of our speakers I know because I've sat down with them in Toronto when they've had workshops. But this is my first time meeting Janina Scarlet, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you here. And I must say that a couple of things interested me in your work, Janina. Number one, my whole career before starting Leading Edge was with teenagers and families. I worked in group homes, and I worked with kids in counseling offices. And I always still know that you have to be very creative, especially in working with kids, because a lot of times they're sent there not because I want to get some therapy to work on my problems, but because someone, their parents or a teacher or their minister said, you should get some help, and they're kind of arm twisted into therapy. So I always thought the more creative tools you can have in working with kids and young people, the better. And when I heard about your superhero therapy, I was intrigued. So let me introduce you to everyone here. And then we're going to talk about your life, how you got into this stuff, and it should be, I think, an enjoyable time together. So first, Dr. Janina Scarlet is a licensed clinical psychologist, and soon we'll talk about her childhood, her early days, and how she developed superhero therapy. Scarlett obtained a master's degree in psychology from Brooklyn College, and then she went on to get a doctorate in neuroscience and clinical psychology from the City University of New York. She earned a postdoctoral degree from Alliant International University, and she's written a bunch of books, including Superhero Therapy, Harry Potter Therapy, Therapy Quest, Dark Agents, Superwomen, Supernatural Therapy, and Super Survivors. Now, I've often read uh, names of titles of books by our psychologists and social work friends. They rarely sounded like that. So I'll tell you that Janina works at the Center for Stress and Anxiety Management in San Diego. And even if the weather is good, people still have anxiety and stress in the San Diego area. So Scarlett, first I want to welcome you. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And honestly, thank you for such an amazing introduction. I'm honored to be here. My sidekick, my cat, Hera, is joining us today as well. And she said earlier she's excited to be here too.
Well, I'm always interested in speakers' stories. For example, Sue Johnson, who developed emotion focused therapy, um, you know, when she's presented for us, she often talks about her childhood spent in her parents' pub, watching how people relate in that pub, family members, neighborhood people who came regularly. And she said that helped shape my thinking about connection and emotions. And I think your story, which I've read about since we haven't met, is very compelling. So I know you were born in the Ukraine in 1983 to a Jewish family, and then Chernobyl happened. Why don't you take us through your childhood? Because I think it's so relevant for how you developed your therapeutic approach.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So, I was born and raised in Ukraine, as you said, and I was born in one of the cities that was completely decimated during World War II. All four of my grandparents were in the Holocaust, and all four of them lost majority of their family members during World War II. And so growing up in Ukraine, for me anyway, you can't help but experience that intergenerational trauma and vicarious trauma because everywhere is a memorial, everywhere is a scene of a terrible, terrible death. And one of the things that really fascinated me were stories of survival. And so, one of my favorite things to do as a kid would be to go outside and sit next to an older person and hear their stories. And I remember I'd be, maybe 5, 6 years old and just asking questions, and people would share their darkest stories with me. And I was fascinated to learn about these moments of triumph and survival and courage and bravery. And I myself had experienced trauma fairly early on. So I was just a few months shy of my third birthday when Chernobyl happened. And I don't know if any of you are from the former Soviet Union or have family members who are friends, but in Ukraine, anyway, our government lied to us for 10 days about. So we didn't know the extent of the radiation spill. So we all got sicker than we should have been. Our treatments were delayed as a result. And so for me, my childhood was spent in and out of hospitals, being very, very sick, not knowing if I would make it to adulthood. And between talking to people and hearing their stories and also reading fictional stories, I really wanted to learn more about heroes, right? Like the kind of heroes that helped people risk their lives and help people during World War II, and also the kind of fictional heroes that risked everything for to stand what they believed in. And I wanted to be like them. I would kind of daydream about having magical powers to heal not only myself, but every child in that hospital, and to somehow go back in time and protect people from the horrors of the war. And when Soviet Union broke up, the rates of anti-Semitism skyrocketed. My family and I were targeted, and it became very unsafe for us to live there. We actually had to apply for a refugee status completely in secret. I remember my mom, me being 10 years old, and my mom telling me, if anyone finds out, we will die. And having to do all that in secret, and then essentially running to United States and coming here as refugees. And so I was 12 when we were finally able to move here. I started seventh grade, and I was that awkward, 12-year-old who not only didn't speak English and didn't know the language and the culture, but, I also just was awkward in general. I think I still am. But I don't know how many of you remember being 12, right? Like, being in seventh grade for those of you that grew up in the United States. And, I usually joke that as adults, we need to start like I survived being 12 support group, right? Because that tends to be some of the most challenging times of our lives, right? 12, 13 years old. And being that awkward, nerdy kid that didn't speak English but was really good in math, I made a really good target for bullying. And because my middle school didn't talk about mental health, I thought I was the only one, right? Like a lot of children of that age, I erroneously thought I was the only one going through depression and anxiety and trauma. I didn't know what those were, but I thought it was just me. And that loneliness is actually what made sorry. So it was that loneliness that made that experience a lot more excruciating. And I was 16 years old when I finally saw a movie that basically changed my life forever. And that movie was The X-Men. I don't know how many of you know The X-Men. Yeah, like, yeah. So kind of. So for those of you that were not familiar, the X-Men are they're kind of like superheroes. They're mutants from the Marvel universe. So the same universe that brought you the Avengers and Spider-Man. So the X-Men all have a genetic mutation, and they all, because of it, have been persecuted and bullied. And in fact, when the movie first opens, it starts in World War II. And it starts with the Holocaust. And I remember just from that first second being hooked in because of my family history, I could relate to that. But then seeing the way that each and every one of the X-Men was persecuted against for being different and bullied for being different. But then what happened is that they banded together and they formed this group, right? The X-Men, Charles Xavier, one of them, started this academy to teach each and every one of them how to use their skills, their superpowers, if you will. And what they did with it is that they started helping each other and they started helping other people to overcome adversity. And as I'm watching this movie, I'm having all these epiphanies. I'm thinking, okay, wait a minute. What if, like the X-Men, what if a lot of us have been through adversity, right? Maybe not necessarily Chernobyl, like radiation poisoning. Maybe not everyone had been subjected to prejudice, although a lot of people have, unfortunately, in one way or another. But what if we all have been made to think that we're alone? What if we're all made to think that nobody else is going through suffering, right? Through some kind of mental health issue, but what if we're all just pretending? And what if the truth is something that we can communicate through fiction? And so in watching this movie was the first time that I realized that we could actually talk to each other about really difficult things by talking about fictional characters. So it's because of that class that I signed up for psychology in high school right after. And now I specialize in incorporating pop culture into therapy to help people understand that their traumatic event is merely an origin story, like every superhero has, a jumping off point, but that the rest of our journey is up to us. And I use stories to help people to destigmatize mental health, to help them build fictional and also real life sidekicks, and to help them to consider how they might be able to become a real life version of a superhero of their own. So I apologize, this was a very long-winded answer to your question, but that would be, I guess, where it all started.
Yeah, so I understand, from what you're saying, it helped you rewrite your story from being a victim to a survivor. And I'm wondering, so you're obviously interested in psychology as a teenager, and then you went to Brooklyn College.
Yep.
How did the idea of actually integrating this into therapy, because you heard a lot of ideas about how to treat people. Did you
Yes.
focus on working with children or young people, or was it and then when you moved on to your master's?
So, I didn't exactly know how it was going to come together. I just knew that I was interested in stories. And my master's and my first PhD was actually in neuroscience, and so my focus more in how the brain works. But what I was really interested in is what happens after we experience trauma. And so between that and then subsequently my clinical work, I started really looking at trauma and how it changes not only what happens biologically, but also what happens psychologically. And what I found is that one of the biggest obstacles to healing tends to be the perceived loneliness that we experience. Not the actual loneliness, right? Not being alone like in a room or a house, but believing that nobody else can relate to us or understand. In fact, more people feel lonely in a crowd, right, than by themselves. And what I found actually through research is that loneliness can have corrosive effects on our mental and physical health. It can wreck our immune system. It can deplete our neurochemicals. It can essentially destroy neural cells in hippocampus, right? We know this. It can cause premature mortality. And I didn't know exactly how to integrate the two, but I knew that I wanted to incorporate stories into helping people with trauma somehow. And then it just accidentally happened when I was doing my postdoc. So I was doing my postdoctoral work in San Diego at Camp Pendleton, working with active duty Marines with PTSD. So these were Marines who just got back from Afghanistan or Iraq. They were still active duty, and every single one of them had a really difficult time relaying what was going on with them because they were afraid of being judged, of being seen as weak or broken. And so they shut down and they were feeling very lonely, even though they were around their fellow Marines. And just about every single one of them would say something along the lines of, I just wanted to be Superman, but I failed. And so that it just hit me like right there because I was like, wait a minute, wait a minute. We're talking about superheroes. I know this, I can do this. And so I said, okay, wait a minute, but is Superman truly invincible or does he have any kind of a vulnerability? Does anyone know Superman's vulnerability?
Kryptonite.
That's right. Yeah, kryptonite, 10 points to Gryffindor. So kryptonite is Superman's vulnerability, right? It's a substance from his home planet to which he's basically allergic to. It weakens his powers. And actually, in large enough quantities, it can kill him. And when Superman is exposed to kryptonite, he needs to recharge, right? Sometimes he needs to fly to the sun. Sometimes he needs to take a break and go to his fortress of solitude that we all sometimes need to do, right? To recharge after a long day of work. And so I would ask my clients these Socratic questions, right? Essentially doing CBT and specifically cognitive processing therapy. And well, they would say, well, yeah, okay, he's vulnerable to kryptonite. And I would say, well, just because he's vulnerable to kryptonite, does that make him any less of a superhero? And they would say, of course not. And then there would be that moment of, okay, I get it, right? We all have a vulnerability. And what was really interesting is that just by those few questions, the stigma about mental health would reduce significantly to where these individuals were then able to tell me about what they witnessed. And they would say, you know how I felt when, let's say, as an example, when I saw my friend getting killed in front of me, I felt like little Bruce Wayne, Batman, right? Felt when he saw his parents being killed in front of him in a dark alley. I felt like a small child. I felt defenseless. I felt like there was nothing I could do. I felt helpless. And these were the words that they couldn't say before. And by comparing themselves to superheroes that they already looked up to, they were able to no longer shame themselves for their experiences. And we would talk about the idea of hopelessness being like an episode of The Walking Dead. We would talk about the idea of creating hope, just like we would see in Star Wars, right? We would talk about these elements that they needed to work on, but through language that they could understand and relate to. And what I saw was so much buy-in, whereas otherwise there was a lot of pushback. And so it essentially sort of came together as kind of an accident. I didn't know where I wanted it to go, but it came together sort of organically. And then it kind of evolved from there.
Well, do you remember the first veteran you tried this with? And can you just tell us a little bit about what your actual experience the first time? Because maybe I wonder if you thought, well, let's see if this is going to work.
I totally did. And so this was actually an active duty service member, and I was on a DoD grant. I was on a Department of Defense grant, which means that it was a research study. I had a binder this big of things I was supposed to say in response to everything. And all of my sessions were recorded, and I had a supervisor that would listen to every single one of my sessions, not only because I was still being supervised as a postdoc, but also for fidelity to the study. And nowhere in that binder, I knew that binder front and back. I read it a whole bunch of times because, hi, I had imposter syndrome, still do, by the way. And so I reread that binder, probably a few hundred times before I started seeing clients. But nowhere in that binder was, what do you say when someone says, hi, I wanted to be Superman and I failed? I knew that there was nowhere in there that it said that. And so I improvised, and I imagine my cheeks were probably the color of my hair, because I remember thinking, I'm doing something wrong. I'm off protocol. I'm going to get fired, right? They're going to say that I'm breaking fidelity. And we were talking about superheroes. And that day, I called my supervisor. I said, okay, listen to the tape and just tell me what you think, right? I uploaded the tape digitally. And I said, tell me what you think. I talked about superheroes. I don't know if this is wrong. And she said, okay, I'll call you back. And she listened to it and she called me back. She said, no, that's great. Go with it. And I was like, really? This is not in our protocol. And she's like, no, no, no. It's still within Socratic questions. Go with it. And so once I got the green light, I felt a little bit more inspired to keep going. And what was really interesting is, so I'm first year postdoc student, right? I don't know what I'm doing. And after a few months, word got out that I was using superheroes in therapy. And so the director of the clinical department at Pendleton came to see me, and he said, so I hear you doing superhero work. And I was like, yeah, we're talking superheroes. Am I not supposed to? Sorry. And he was like, so do you like go to Comic-Con and stuff? And I was like, yeah. He was like, can you get me tickets? And I was like, maybe. So then he said, okay, here's the deal. Next week, we're doing grand rounds. I want you to do a presentation. And I was like, wait, a what and a what? And so, like second or third month into my postdoc training, I'm, this little like imposter syndrome trainee, and I'm asked to give a grand round to these professional, most of them active duty doctors, right? Navy doctors. So I did. And I expected everyone to say, this is BS. I expected people to walk out. No one did. I, I've been doing this work for almost 10 years now. I'm still expecting the imposter police to come get me. Like, I'm just kind of waiting. But just 99% of places where I've presented this and communicated about it, people have been more than receptive, which always surprises me because I keep thinking like I'm doing something wrong. But what was really amazing is that a few weeks after I did that presentation, one of the active duty psychologists came in to see me, and they said, I tried this superhero thing. It works. Good job. And it was just not something I anticipated. Working with higher ranking officers in the military, like admirals, for example, and then having them say, I never realized the importance of this work. And then going to tell their Marines to go to ask for therapy was something I also didn't expect. And working in a military setting where mental health is such a taboo, that it showed me just how important this kind of a language can be to accessing the clients that typically would be very resistant to going to therapy.
So when you started out and as this progressed, were you listening for clues about people's own interest in superheroes, or like how did you know when to make the move into going into hero talk as opposed
Yeah.
to their anxiety, their trauma, whatever? What
Yeah.
were you listening for?
Yeah, so when I first started out, again, I was, trying to primarily stick with the protocol. Now, a part of my intake session is what are you into? Are there movies, TV shows, books, comic books, video games that you like? Back then, I would just, if I would hear them say, like, hey, it feels like an episode of The Walking Dead, then I would bring that in, especially once I got the green light from my supervisor. But I remember this one time, I actually, stepped further than, I think I probably felt comfortable with, but it felt like clinically the right thing to do. One of my clients, so a Marine, was injured in line of duty, came back, and although he still had both of his feet, his function was really poor. He was supposed to be in a wheelchair. He was supposed to have a wheelchair sticker, a disability sticker, and he was refusing, right? He was saying, I'm not disabled. He would use two walking sticks. He would still park really far away, and he would often re injure himself. And when he came in, he kept saying, I just wanted to be a superhero. I wanted to be like Batman. I just wanted to run around and help my kid and help my wife. And I just feel like I'm broken now. And so I was listening for that. And, I was thinking, okay, Batman is a superhero. He does like he's been through trauma, but he doesn't present himself in that way and he doesn't use the word broken. But when I did a little bit of research on superheroes with disabilities, I found Batgirl. So she's also from the Bat family, right? She's one of the Justice League members. And Batgirl at one point was injured by the Joker. And as a result, she was in a wheelchair for a long period of time. She went through trauma. She had a difficulty walking. But what she realized as a result of therapy is that she didn't have to be Batgirl to be a superhero. She didn't have to use her legs to fight supervillains to be a superhero. She also had a library degree. She was a librarian. And so Barbara Gordon, Batgirl, then became Oracle, who used her research skills to be basically the most important superhero in the world for the Justice League. And so the following week, when I came back, I told that client, I said, I know that you're really looking up to Batman. I know that you said that you often feel broken. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Batgirl. So I brought in the comic and I shared it with him and I told him about what it was about. And he was quiet. And honestly, it was one of those sessions where I was like, I lost him. You know, that session where you're like, he's not coming back. So next session, he shows up on time for the first time. He's in a wheelchair, big smile, and he's like, you won't believe how fast I am in this thing, right? So he realized that he could try it out like Barbara Gordon did. He chased his son around. He was able to wheel groceries in for his wife from the car. And he stopped isolating as a result. And after a while, like he started saying things, I guess I'm kind of like Oracle now. And it was really meaningful for that. So I guess the short, the abbreviated answer is I was listening for any kind of cues about shame about disability, any kind of cues about the kind of heroes that they looked up to, and would try to bring those in to take away that shame, stigma, and alienation.
Wow. So we're talking about the relatively early days, but then you've written several books. You discuss this as present this as an evidence-based technique. So just tell us how that rolled out, and if there's been research, and what you're finding as you teach this to other people. Um, just what your experience has been.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for saying that. So, superhero therapy can be used as a tool to be incorporated in evidence-based therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, etc. And research related to this is fairly new, right? We've only been at it for a couple of decades. There's only maybe 2 or 3 dozen articles related to this. Research related to this kind of work is typically termed as parasocial relationships or social surrogacy. So basically, parasocial relationships are one-sided relationships that people form with fictional characters. I imagine at least some of you have probably mourned a fictional character's death, right? Because sometimes fictional characters feel like a part of our family. And in fact, for a lot of people where the emotional support is absent, fictional characters become a social surrogate system of support, right? So a surrogate friend, a surrogate family member, surrogate support group, or for some people, a surrogate romantic partner. And the research that I've done myself and also have looked into suggests that parasocial relationships reduce the feelings of loneliness and rejection more than self-esteem work does. And what we know is that the biggest obstacle that people with trauma, anxiety, and depression face is loneliness, right? Perceived loneliness. And so far, what I'm finding is that this kind of work can allow people to take the shame and stigma out, to be able to self-disclose more and to be more willing to do the hard stuff, whether it's exposures, things like that. So a research study that I've just recently collaborated on that completed in India ran a 10-week Harry Potter therapy group for college students. So every week, students would meet, they would talk about elements of Harry Potter through the lens of acceptance and commitment therapy and discuss their own struggles with anxiety and depression and learn mindfulness, acceptance skills, right, core values, self-compassion, etc. And what we found were significant increases in self-compassion and acceptance practices and significant reductions in depression. And so that study is just now being written up for publication. So those are just some examples, but research is still fairly green. I do want to be honest about that, but it is ongoing.
We'll open this up for questions very soon. So if you would like to ask Janina a question, just go to the chat line right now, and then we'll open it up for hand raising. Um, is one of the topics that most therapists are dealing with and are looking for tools is trauma, dealing with people with trauma. And you wrote Dark Agents, Violet and the Trial of Trauma. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and how you work with trauma people, both in terms of young people or adults?
Sure. A lot of people define themselves by their trauma. And the work that I've been focusing on is looking at trauma as an origin story. Every single superhero, every single fictional character, whether we look at Harry Potter or Luke Skywalker, has an origin story that starts with trauma. But then it's usually that character's decision to use their experience to help other people that helps them to develop post-traumatic growth, right? Meaning making and some kind of giving back that allows that person to essentially find ways for healing. And what we know is that meaning making and giving back reduces PTSD symptomatology. So in therapy, that's what we focus on, is defining an origin story, finding a heroic role model like Batman, for example, and then thinking about ways to give back, ways to support other people in the beginning of their traumatic journey. Violet and the Trial of Trauma was a graphic novel, a fictionalized graphic novel that I wrote for children and teenagers to help them see the story of a young girl, a witch called Violet with a history of trauma, who decides to become a dark agent, a kind of, FBI type of an agent who fights supernatural type forces. But in order to do that, she has to learn mental health skills. Otherwise, she won't be able to make it. And so my goal here is to have readers learn mental health skills kind of accidentally, not as a self-help book, but as a fiction, graphic novel, fantasy book, where maybe they're going into it for entertainment purposes and learning mental health skills such as mindfulness, core values, etc.
Okay, wow. Well, I'd like to open it up. I could ask you more questions, but I don't want to deprive our wonderful audience of clinicians, mostly, if they would like to ask you anything. Emily, do you have any questions yet? Oh,
Oh,
you're
of course
muted.
we do. We've got lots already. Um, Marjolaine, you had a question. Do you want to unmute? Oh, sorry, let's just get you unmuted. There you go.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first, it's kind of emotional for me right now. I'm not sure how long my question is, but me, I started last year to have a obsession about a movie, which is like Joker,
Mhm.
2019,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's basically just like the story of my life. Like it's the same abuse with the mother. It's everything. How the system's treating me. I was like, I became severely obsessed with it, and I started to do like the cosplay about Arthur and Joker, the character. Um, Now it became like a therapy for me. Like I do the scenes of the movie, and like I can express the emotions I was never able to express before. And I'm just wondering at what extent it can be negative, because like I almost do it every day. And I was wondering, I started a website about this. I still have a lot of anxiety. You can see it now. I have like severe trauma, agoraphobia, social phobia. I have no access to therapy. Um, I started a website to help other people. Like it helped me, but I don't know like what keywords to use. It is like superhero therapy. It is like hero's journey, psychodrama. I was just wondering, and also
Thank
I just
you.
wanted to add, like, for the first time, I felt understood by someone, and it was like Arthur and Joker in the movie. And I met the actor, and I talked to him about it. It was a big deal.
Wow. That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much for asking that question. And honestly, thank you for this incredible movement that you started because I imagine that you're definitely not alone in this. The movie did well, and it did well because it resonates with so many people who survived abuse, who survived trauma, who didn't get access to services, who were neglected by the system. And I'm so glad that you found something that spoke to you in this way. And actually, um, I don't think there's anybody that can tell you what's healthy and what's not healthy. It's what works for you. And it sounds like for you, in having this daily, almost like a mindfulness practice in connecting with this film, it's allowing you perhaps, I don't want to tell you how you feel, what I heard anyways, that it's allowing you to feel less lonely and more accepted and more mindful, more present, more grounded. And now you're doing this to help other people. I think that's incredible.
Hmm. I think it's because a lot of times people focused on, I've been called a psychopath. They said like, yeah, but he's murdering people. And I'm like, yeah, but me, I focus on, there's one scene in a movie when he walks like out of the subway, slow motion. And for me, the scene is the key
Yeah.
scene, the vibe I want to have.
Yeah.
And it started to work.
You know,
And like,
go ahead, please.
I met the actor, and I Joaquin Phoenix, and he just like exploded in tears, and he said like, I never heard that before for a role.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And I'm so glad you brought this up. This is something that I'll definitely be talking about in the training. This question comes up a lot. People, therapists, for example, will sometimes ask, okay, but my client likes the Joker, for example. Should I be worried about whether my client is going to do something violent? And the answer is absolutely not, right? We like who we like. There's a reason why we like certain characters. In the decade I've been practicing this, maybe I've been lucky, but whenever I ask my clients, what makes you like this particular character, I've never had somebody say, I like that they kill people and I want to do that too. What I've had people say is, I can relate to this character's origin story, right? Which sounds like that might be the case for you. I've had people say, I like that this character doesn't have to answer to anyone. They can do whatever they want, right? They have their own schedule, their own rules. Whereas for a lot of us, we have a very rigid lifestyle, right? Get up, go to work or go to school, right? Come home, do homework or help the kids with homework, rinse and repeat. But villains don't have to do any of that. They do whatever they want. They're fun, right? And also, villains are sexy. They're just cool, right? There's just something fun in this like vicarious invitation to be naughty. And I got to tell you, I've been using villains to help people find their voice of assertiveness. Like Kylo Ren is one that I use a lot in therapy in terms of helping people find that voice of standing up for what they believe in, especially for women, because a lot of women have been taught that we're not allowed to be angry, which is not true, of course. Anger is an important emotion. And so we work on experiencing anger, right? Connecting to the dark side, practicing assertiveness, but without killing people. So the idea is to actually find that connection, which you have found, right, with Joker, to find that part of ourselves that maybe has been neglected and misunderstood. And I'm so glad that you found it. I'm so glad that you shared it because I imagine there's probably at least one other person that feels the same way, even if they're not able to say it just yet. And I imagine that everything you do, say, and share is probably helping more people than you realize. And you probably saved a life and you probably don't even know it. So thank you for what you do.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Our next question in the chat, do you only use fictional characters? So for example, not larger than life pop culture figures such as Lady Gaga.
Thank you so much for saying that. Actually, no. So I use whatever role models my clients look up to. Because of what I do, kind of as self-selection, I get more people who are into pop culture. So most of them want to talk about fictional characters, which are not traditional superheroes only. These could be, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Doctor Who characters. But we also do talk about pop culture models like Lady Gaga, like Lizzo, right? Representations of body positivity. We talk about athletic role model, religious role models, historical role models, personal role models that might no longer be alive, like people's grandparents, right? For those of you who are therapists who are familiar with the empty chair exercise, right, especially from a compassionate role model from Gilbert's work, right, and Kristen Neff's work, I've kind of used some of that framework just with a fictionalized character or with another role model character. So if Lady Gaga was here, what would she encourage you to do right now? Absolutely. Thanks for that question.
Yeah. And the next one is, do you apply this to early developmental trauma, and how do young women relate to this approach?
100%. So I primarily work with adults. I do work with some adolescents. I have worked with a few kids and I consult on how to do this work with people of all ages. But one of the most common types of trauma that I see now working in the civilian sector, because I used to work in the military sector, now working in the civilian sector are sexual assault, people across all sexes and gender identities who have experienced it, and developmental trauma. I am one of the people strongly advocating for developmental trauma to be its own diagnosis in the DSM because the PTSD doesn't quite cut it. And people seem to resonate with it quite well because when we look at someone like Harry Potter, for example, we can spend a whole day talking about the ethics of Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling, whose morals I do not agree with. But Harry Potter is a well-known example of developmental trauma and child abuse, and something that I've had a number of people say that reading about it helped them to A, recognize it was happening to them, and B, to be able to either advocate for themselves or to survive just knowing that they weren't alone in this. Right. And for a lot of people who go through developmental trauma, they internalize, right? They attack themselves. They think it's their fault. But being able to see, hey, wait a minute, it's not my fault. My family's being abusive, just like maybe the Dursleys, who were Harry Potter's abusive relatives. Maybe I too am being abused and bullied for my identity. For some people, it could be their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or going through an emotional disability, some kind of a mental health disorder. maybe essentially I'm growing up with my own version of the Dursleys. A lot of people really resonate with that. And again, it takes away that shame and stigma to where people can then get to the core of their trauma.
Thank you. Can you speak a bit more about dialectical thinking as a tool and the concept of superpowers and where you see any similarities and differences?
Oh, great question. I wish we had like 5 more hours to talk about that. Um, I don't specialize in DBT, but I do find in general there's so many tools from DBT that I do pull from. My training is more in CBT and ACT. But in general, I think we tend to think about things in binary terms, which is not helpful, right? Like we tend to think of somebody as either a hero or a villain. We tend to think of somebody as either weak or strong. But being able to look at fictional characters, we might be able to see, wait a minute, somebody could be flawed and be a good person, right? Somebody could be struggling and be incredibly strong. And if anything, struggling doesn't mean we're weak. Struggle is when we determine the core of our strength.
Thank you. Samia has a question. Samia, do you want to unmute?
Yes, Janine, thank you so much. It just brought a lot of my own therapy, and I watch anime. I love anime, and I don't know if you, for some of you who know Naruto. Naruto is a character. It's 500 episodes, but I was doing a group with young people one day, and I brought Naruto, and at that moment, before I brought Naruto, things were quiet, with young people. And then when I brought Naruto, everything happened. Everybody, because there's a lot of lessons to learn from Naruto. He's talking about developmental trauma, it's all about that with Naruto. And what it took for this boy to be this hero. Yep. Anyways, I love continue to watch anime, and I'm using it now. I didn't know actually that you can use it I just did it instinctively.
Yes.
I never knew there was such a thing as a therapy that could use superheroes, but I've been doing it with all types of anime and movies, and always use what people actually watch. But anime seems to work so well. Anyways, do you use anime? Is that something, do you watch it on purpose? You go around looking to what people are watching so that you can actually use it?
Thank you for bringing up anime. Yes, I do use anime. I do watch anime. I've also learned a lot about anime from my clients. And one of the things I always tell therapists is our role is not to be the expert in pop culture, and therefore we don't need to be afraid to go into the unknown because we're asking our clients to do the same. Right. And so I always say to do superhero therapy, you don't have to be the expert. And your client is the expert in pop culture, right? You're the expert in the therapy you're providing. And so a lot of times a client will bring up some kind of anime I've never seen. Like, 2 years ago, my client first brought up Demon Slayer, and I didn't know anything about Demon Slayer back then. And she was going through severe trauma. Her parents were complaining, this was a teenager, her parents were complaining that she was spending 8 hours a day watching anime and not socializing with them. Well, as we started talking about Demon Slayer, I started asking her, okay, what is it about? Who are the characters? Was there a character with a trauma history? Right? There always is. And how did this character deal with this trauma? And do you find any similarities with this character? And what was really interesting is what unfolded and how for this teen, watching this anime was a way for her to understand her trauma, and her parents were trying to get her to stop watching it and do something real, not realizing that she already was. And so over the course of our therapy, I had her show me certain clips or episodes. Now I've seen it. I've seen the entire first season. I read the books. I watched the movie. I have the t-shirt. I'm waiting for the second season. So I'm on board, right? But my point is, you don't have to know the show if you're a therapist to work with the client. And I asked the parents to watch at least one episode of this show with the client at least once a week, and their relationship improved significantly because now they were able to talk about the characters, and then as a result, their daughter started opening up to them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also telling my clients to the parents to watch it with their children,
Yes.
and it works out so well. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Samia.
Adam has a question. Adam, do you want to unmute? Hi, Adam.
Sure. Hi, Janina. I am stoked to meet you today and to see you and to actually meet a fellow nerd that is a clinician that has that much passion for fandom. As you can see from around me in my basement, I have a little bit of everything. So I'm a nurse and a clinical therapist here in
Nice.
Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And I just wanted to ask you, and first off, thanks Emily and Michael for hosting such an amazing guest today. But I wanted to ask you, when you think about all fandoms, pop culture, superhero characters, which one do you most identify and resonate with? And have you ever, I know that's hard. That's like saying Marvel or DC. Like
Yeah.
you can't do it, right? Like it's impossible. But who do you most identify and resonate with? And do you feel that you've been able to use that as a self-disclosure with your clients in therapy to be able to help build that trust and establish that rapport and build that connection?
Wow, what a great question. It's going to be really hard for me to answer it. I mean, I'm
I know
really
it's a
into
5-hour answer, probably,
right. It is a 5 hour. It's over the course of 1 minute. I'm just going to try to answer it in 1 minute. So I'm a big Marvel fan. X-Men got me into nerddom. So I think X-Men will always be in my heart. Storm is my favorite superhero of all time. Although a superhero I identify with the most has to be the Scarlet Witch, and not only because of my last name, but just because, so many things. Grief, trauma, loss, being an immigrant, and also I do really love the Harry Potter books. Again, I don't support the author. I'm not endorsing the author, but I do very much love the Harry Potter books. So thank you. Thank you for
Awesome,
bringing that
thank
up.
you.
Have you found particular therapeutic models that are more conducive to working with superheroes, for example, internal family systems?
Thank you so much for asking about internal family systems. So for me personally, and for the people I've consulted with, and now I've taught this the intensive course for therapists all over the world, which pandemic has made it so much easier to do virtually, like we'll be doing. And it seems like it doesn't really require any particular modality. I have incorporated it into internal family systems and even into EMDR. And I've had therapists who reached out to me saying that they've incorporated it into psychodynamic therapy and kind of traditional family systems therapy. That's not something I specialize in, but it was cool to hear that people are doing it. It's now being utilized in hospitals to help children with chronic health issues to stay on top of their treatment. It's being utilized in prisons to help promote redemption and reduce certain acts. And I'll be honest, like I didn't expect the kind of spread that I've been seeing. It's been really exciting, but from what I'm observing, it seems to be a kind of tool you can really flexibly incorporate into, I think, just about any system.
Thank you. Joanna has her hand up. So Joanna, let's get you unmuted.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask a question about, so I work in Ontario, Canada at a university. So my work is with students. And I do find a lot that I talk about Dungeons and Dragons a lot with those students. And so kind of a two-part thing. Do you use Dungeons and Dragons in the same way? And then if so, I feel Dungeons and Dragons is a little bit different because the characters aren't created for you. You're creating your own character. So I wondered if you could comment on how what you've been telling us about might apply to D&D.
Thank you so much. And I will touch on that in the training. So there are therapists out there who are amazing, who are doing almost exclusively D&D work in therapy, which is great. And now there are research studies that are coming out on the kind of things it can be helpful with. Me personally, so big fan of D&D. I kind of do sort of like a simplified version of D&D. So to where we create a character, and I find that that can be really helpful for a client in terms of self-expression, right? And then we would go on some kind of a quest that might be 1 or 2 sessions where the purpose would be for the client to practice a kind of skill that they've been afraid to practice in real life, IRL for now. So, for example, assertiveness, right? Or sharing their trauma story. So they will do it as an elf standing up to an orc, for example, right? As they're trying to, to save some kind of a fairy or something like that. And yeah, I found that to be really a really helpful, interactive, and engaging way for the client to practice their skills before they do the skill outside of the therapy setting. So absolutely, and I hope you continue to do that. I think that's such a great way to work with clients, especially groups.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question. Aside from listening for cues of superhero talk from the client, would you bring up or ask the client what superhero or character they identify with?
I do. Yes. Thank you. So typically during my intake, the first, let's say 75% are spent on the presenting problem, and the remainder is spent on their passions, their interests, and who they identify with, which can continue for several sessions sometimes. And I do certain exercises where I ask clients to think about a kind of hero that they identify with, and separately also might look up to. Those could be different, right? They might identify with Luke Skywalker, but for example, want to be mentored by Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? And so I might ask them if there was somebody like a mentor figure who was here right now who could support you in this moment, who might that be? And it might be different in different sessions. So we might have a group of different superheroes in their corner.
Thank you. I think I have one quick short question before our hour is up. So with a client who reenacts her trauma by putting herself in at risk with men bullying or narcissistic men, are there any superheroes you would recommend that this therapist looks into?
Great question. Is this an adult or a child, I wonder? So for adults, because it sounded like it was probably an adult, right? It could be a teenager. So if this is an adult, I would recommend looking at Jessica Jones. Jessica Jones is a Marvel superhero who experienced sexual assault and had engaged in series of risky and unhealthy behaviors during the course of her trauma until she found a reason for post-traumatic growth, because she found that other women were being abused. And so that could be a way of developing post-traumatic growth.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. You are such a breath of fresh air. And I think all therapists are looking for creative ways, especially when you're feeling a bit stuck. So we're going to have to end, but I can see by many smiling faces on my screen, familiar ones and some new ones, what you're offering and who you are is so much appreciated. And you have the second to last word, because you can have the second to last word. Then we'll open up all our microphones and people can say their thank yous and goodbyes to you. So over to you, Janina. I really look forward to seeing you in early December.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for being wonderful. And again, I just wanted to remind you that you've probably saved a life. You've probably been there for other people more than you realize. So please keep doing what you're doing, and thank you for being wonderful.